Hello and welcome back to our talk about political beliefs and behaviors. We're going to be looking at participation in politics. Up until this point in this module, we've been looking at how attitudes are formed in the American political system. Now we're going to be looking at the actual behaviors that influence government leaders, that influence the turnout of elections, that influence how political campaigns are decided. So I want to begin by first thinking about a couple of different ways that we as political scientists and communication researchers think about political participation. Political participation is a behavior. So as opposed to something that you might think about, an attitude, a behavior is actually doing something. So political participatory behaviors can be direct, indirect, or symbolic. Direct participation could include an act like voting or a behavior like campaign volunteering or protesting or petitioning the government. The First Amendment to the Bill of Rights protects the right to petition the government for redress of grievances. So this is where we start to get into some major participatory behaviors that we're going to be talking about in this unit. Indirect forms of participation can include things that have a more passive influence on government officials, that take a more indirect route to influencing the affairs of government. So this could be, for example, the ice bucket challenge that you might have seen a number of your friends doing on Facebook a few years ago for ALS, as well as talking politics or reading the news. Again, these are indirect forms of participation that can, in some circumstances, lead to direct forms of political participation. There's also symbolic forms of participation, for example, singing the national anthem at a baseball game. And these types of activities, again, are symbolic in nature. They don't necessarily have a direct influence on the affairs of government, but they illustrate in some way affinity and national identity. It is a type of behavior. What we know, according to the research, is that most individuals engage in voting as a form of political participation. We know that in a lot of ways, rates of political participation over time have declined. There has been an uptick in the 2008 and 2012 presidential elections in terms of overall voter participation in elections and in terms of voting. But across time, if you look in the 20th century, the rates of political participation have declined. Now, there could be two reasons for this. The first is, for example, a general distrust in government that happened after the Vietnam War, as well as the Watergate scandal in the 1970s. But also, the way that we do elections in the United States now is much more honest than how they were done in the 1800s. And what I mean by honest is that we have secret ballots now, as opposed to we have the Australian ballot design, a secret ballot, as opposed to political parties in the 1800s giving individuals particular ballots that were already filled out or that were not cast in secret. So some elections in the 1800s recorded astronomical turnout. But if you look, for example, at who was eligible to vote, you will also see that in these elections, the electorate was much smaller, landowning males or just males in general. It wasn't until the 20th century when you get other particular and powerful groups coming into the voting process, women, African Americans, who would not only expand the pool of the electorate, but also change how elections were decided. You also have 18-year-olds being eligible to vote in the 1970s. So what you see here is that how political participation in the United States has been determined has changed over time. And that will ultimately influence who turns out in elections, as well as those general turnout rates that news media personnel like to talk about. So I want to talk with you briefly about direct forms of political participation. These, again, are the direct pressure ways in which we as citizens in the United States pressure our elected officials to change policies or to reconsider certain bills that might be proposed in Congress. So the most direct form of political participation is voting. And based on state laws, there are certain qualifications that individuals must meet in terms of residency requirements, in terms of the age at which you're eligible to vote in a general election versus a primary. These are important state-by-state differences. In some states, for example, felons are not eligible to vote. There are also voter registration restrictions in some states, as well as voter identification laws that ultimately as well will influence the complexion of the final makeup of the electorate at campaign time. Secondly, you have contacting elected officials. These can be things like writing a letter or making a phone call or speaking at a town hall meeting that your U.S. senator or your U.S. congressman might be holding in your neighborhood. Third type of direct participation is protesting. And protesting essentially involves some type of either civil disobedient act, which is some type of violation of law in order to get some sort of law changed or to get something changed in return. You also have instances, for example, in the past couple of years, protests by the Tea Party movement, Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, just as some examples of groups and organizations that have come together around particular purposes to change policies or to change practices that have become entrenched in the United States. The next big type of direct participation is campaign engagement. And these can be things like door knocking or canvassing for a particular candidate or a particular cause, donating money to a political campaign. Donating money is actually quite easy if you have the means to do it, because it takes less time than making phone calls at election time or door knocking. I've included a link here to a video in the C-SPAN archives that you can see then Senator Barack Obama, before he was elected president, addressing his supporters in New Hampshire before they were about to go out and canvass for Barack Obama's candidacy. I encourage you to watch that video. Again, as I've reiterated to you throughout these lectures, these types of videos and examples are great for the evidence that you bring to bear in the AP Government essay questions that will be asked of you. Finally, another big direct form of political participation is running for office. So if we think about the person who decides to run for a local council, or run for state representative, or run for president of the United States, or run for dog catcher, this is another form of direct political participation in the United States. Indirect forms of political participation assist with raising awareness about politics, and this awareness could then lead to more direct forms of political participation. These indirect forms of political participation include things like reading or watching the news, discussing politics with a friend or family member, writing a letter to the editor, or wearing a button or a sticker for your favorite candidate. Again, the big point to understand here is these are more passive forms of engagement. So they don't have a direct pressure linked to an elected official, but what they do is they might raise awareness about a political issue with friends or family or with yourself. And in turn, that might then influence other more direct forms of political participation, voting, petitioning, those types of more direct activities. One thing I want to impart upon you is that in the digital age, participatory activities can be translated both online and offline. So recent research in political science, for example, has attempted to classify some of these behaviors based on offline and online behaviors. So direct participation behaviors are more active. They are more direct. So offline, for example, direct participation would be voting. However, a direct form of participation online could also be e-voting, which some states have attempted to implement for election campaigns. Another form of online direct participation is petitioning the government. So for example, if you've ever seen your friends share a change.org petition with you, or if you've gone on the whitehouse.gov website, the official website for the White House, you might see, for example, a We the People petition. And individuals can go on and create and sign a petition that if it receives enough views, 100,000 at this taping in the Obama administration, that then earns an official response from President Obama's White House. So again, a direct form of online participation. When we look at more indirect forms of participation, again, you can see offline it includes things like reading the newspaper or reading digital news online or talking about politics with a friend or family member. If you look online at indirect forms of political participation, it could be, for example, liking a friend's Facebook post or retweeting a journalist or following a political figure on Snapchat. Again, these are indirect forms because they're more passive. They don't necessarily have a direct influence where you are providing feedback to an elected official. If you're providing direct feedback to government, that's a more direct form of political participation, according to the recent political science literature. So I wanted to begin with giving you a broad overview of what the participatory landscape could look like, from very active forms of participation to very passive forms of political participation. Then I wanted to add in how these might vary based on whether or not you're in an online setting or an offline setting. So in the next video, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking specifically at the voting process. and trying to understand how does voting work in the United States, who is inspired to vote, as well as particular outcomes associated with the voting process. So I look forward to seeing you in the next video.